way more clever than I am. I'm just a gas bagger. Like I just have opinions, and he makes this thing a thing.
I
So,
have a vision,
all
but it's
right.
not about me today. Dan, how do you know Terry?
I actually know Terry. I was looking for a job, and Terry was one of the people that I connected with in that process. So I've known Terry for a couple of years, and we crossed paths in the context of
Data,
opportunities to
data
work.
science guys.
Yeah, data
And what are
science
you
guys.
playing? What's in the background? I see guitars. I see amps. Are you in a music dungeon like I am?
Yes, Music Dungeon for sure. So I've got Fender Strat, I've got a Martin acoustic behind that, and then I've got a stage amp and an old vacuum tube Ovation from the '70s.
Do you play music with Terry?
I do not. No, we
Oh,
haven't we haven't
that's
we
a
haven't crossed
shame.
that bridge yet, but we should.
I don't think I've played with Terry. Have I? No. I
We're
I'll, I got to podcast co-host before I got to even play music, even practice. We've never played instruments even simultaneously. I've never been to his shows. None of that stuff. So I really feel like I'm kind of it's just a gulf that I don't know that we'll ever cross. So Dan, you and I have that in common for now.
Yeah. What do you play?
I primarily play guitar, but I kind of backed off of that and got more into production. I was just messing around with my neighbor's vintage, but not vintage enough to be cool and nice, mostly just vintage, meaning old and weird. He's got a keyboard. So a couple people in the neighborhood come over. And the last thing we did with that was, hey, we're going to use the voices that are in that keyboard. It has to sound like the 80s keyboard. And then we're going to make a song around the 80s keyboard sound. And it was a test to see if we could do it and have the music sound quasi-contemporary and not lame, like it was coming from a 35-year-old keyboard that was not that cool. It's not like Terry's vintage amps. It's just old.
Old and vintage, two different things.
Exactly. One of them is cool. One of them can be cool. Dan,
I think
sorry, go ahead, Terry. You're next.
I was just going to say, I think that's too much of a thing with musicians, though, that just because something is old doesn't mean it's cool. And just because something is new does not mean it's not cool. I got shamed, and here's the reason why. So, Dan, I don't know if you're familiar with Kemper profilers. It's a modeling head that is the coolest thing ever, and some of the best sounds I've ever heard come from that. Well, I mentioned that at my band rehearsal, and I got shamed, and I didn't appreciate it. So,
What's the average age of your band members?
40 up to 50.
Would you call them more vintage or old?
Oh, 100% vintage. More, well, I love them. I love them, even with their rigid, sort of positions on instruments and what's cool. I love them.
Dan, you know Terry from Data Science Land. You work for an MRO company, right, Zorro?
Correct. Yes.
Would you say that you're passionate about MRO? There's no wrong answer here. I'm just curious.
I'm passionate about solving problems, and I just happen to be solving MRO problems today. So before that, I was far from the MRO space. I worked in government for a long time. I was in the Navy submarine program for a while as an engineer there. So I've seen my fair share of different kinds of problems. So MRO to me is an interesting one, but not one that I would say is my life's work.
And how long have you been in MRO?
About 5 years.
Okay. And can you give your version? So previously, we've had people with acronyms, and I try and explain my version of the acronym, and they try and explain their version of the acronym and the explanation. Could you give us what MRO is if you had to explain it to your neighbor who watches your dog sometimes but isn't really your friend?
Yeah. Tough challenges here. So MRO, maintenance, repair, and operations, essentially all the things that businesses need to do their day-to-day operations. So it could be anything from tools to safety equipment to janitorial supplies, essentially all of the things that you need to run a business.
Yeah, okay. That's much more succinct than mine, but it does sound like you've said it before.
Once or twice.
I think I would have gone with all this. So it's maintenance, repair, and operations. which is basically a supply house. So you've got office supplies for offices. You've got other kinds of businesses that need other kinds of supplies. It's the van that shows up or the packages that show up and, you know, distribute the goods and odds and ends that allow you to do your business. Mostly not big capital equipment and mostly not IT stuff, but more or less every single other thing.
Correct.
Which is why it's an interesting problem to solve for a data scientist, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we operate in the e-commerce space. And so there's lots of e-commerce related problems that also are interesting because they're MRO problems. So you think, for example, recommendations. So if I need to build a recommendations engine, which we've done, that's actually a really hard problem to solve. And my current company has about 12 million items, which is a very large product assortment. And so you have this massive space of items and you're trying to match a customer to one or multiple of those items. And like the amount of data science work and machine learning and just science that goes into that is actually really impressive. And so that's, like I said, it's an interesting problem to me. And so I gravitate toward interesting problems.
Okay, so you said recommendations. Terry brings up AI from time to time with me, and that causes me to have, I feel like I get it, and then I feel like I don't get it again shortly after I've walked away from whatever the last thing he told me was.
Is he getting the game?
Huh?
Is he getting the game?
The game? No, I don't have an AI or no AI game today. But the recommendation. Okay, so the recommendation is the piece that I have the easiest time wrapping my head around. If I listened to a classic rock song and that implies that I like classic rock. If a computer knows that I listen to a classic rock song because I picked it from Spotify or started a Pandora station or whatever, I now have some tastes, and there's a bunch of other songs, and there's classification and categorization of the things that song has in common, genre, types of instruments, whether there's vocals, year of release, record label, blah, 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 blah. And then magic happens and I get suggested the next thing. That's basically my best grasp of a functioning AI problem. Is it even an AI problem? Do I have that correct here?
So let's take a step back.
Please.
AI
as many as you need.
AI as a concept, I think, is one of those things that's pretty vaguely defined in general. So if you ask 10 different people what is an AI system and what is not, you'll get a lot of different answers. You'll probably get 10 or maybe more answers. So in the recommendation space, there's tons of ways that you can solve these problems that have no, what I would call AI component to them. Now, I think there's a lot of interesting things happening with the GPTs, ChatGPT, these large language models that are actually augmenting the way that you think about how you might identify what item is relevant or what a customer might want. But you don't have to. There's a lot of just statistical modeling that you can do behind the scenes that actually gets you pretty far when you think about, in your case, how to relate. I like this song, therefore I like this other song. That in a lot of cases comes down to just crunching large matrices of numbers and getting out reasonable results at the end. So I'd say can be an AI problem, doesn't have to be. If you go the AI route, you probably run into a lot of challenges that are not well solved at this moment.
Terry's going to ask you how it works. I have more questions about making this a story. Can you help me imagine a person who is buying from you or your company? Like what do they do? What's their name? Where do they work? How do they interact with Zorro? Like paint me a picture of who this person is. Is it Terry?
I don't know. Terry, do you buy MRO supplies?
Off the black market.
There you go. So when I think about a customer for Zorro, we're really looking at small and medium businesses. These are potentially machine shops, manufacturing facilities, construction.
Do you have a favorite segment of your customers?
We get a lot of construction. So, you get a lot of cyclical interest throughout the year. You get people who have to buy lots of different kinds of things.
They build in houses. They build in shopping centers. What kind of thing are they building?
These are typically companies that are going to be doing things like renovations, upgrades. They're not kind of the core general contractor who's going to build your, downtown shopping plaza. But they're the people who are going to need consistently to buy light switches, faucets, toilets, all the things that you would need to actually work through supporting those kinds of facilities. And so we see a lot of that where people will come in and buy a wide variety of things, and figuring out how they actually choose what they choose in that broad product assortment is actually pretty interesting. So
Terry hires a guy to renovate his farmhouse, and there's electrical components to the project. There's plumbing components to the project. There's bits and bobbles of wiring, as well as, actual big pieces and components. There's shop rags, there's saw blades, there's all the stuff that these guys are going to need. And it's generally one person at that company is the buyer that's interacting with you. Is that right?
Can be one. Sometimes we have one, sometimes we have a lot. But yeah, for the purposes of these small and medium businesses, it's often one person buying from us.
And this role is occasionally just called a buyer or procurement?
Yep.
Okay. This is really testing my knowledge of the space here. So I feel a little bit on the hot seat. Okay. So they then interact with Zorro by way of primarily e-commerce, right?
E-commerce, correct.
Okay.
Yep.
This is a silly question, but do they get there from their phone? Or like, are they on the job site looking on the phone? Or they sit in an office?
They can be
all computer based.
Yeah, it's all online, so you can access it from desktops, mobile devices, wherever you want. A fair bit of our customer base is maybe a little old school, so they come through on desktop computers. Maybe that's the shop computer or the office computer, but they're coming, looking to buy certain things that they specifically need, and we have to help try to route them to those. Can I ask a question real quick?
Please.
In the context of kind of where we want to take this conversation. So happy to talk a lot about kind of where we are in kind of the MRO space. One of the things that I've done a lot of work on that could be really interesting here is kind of the AI space in general. So prior to coming to Zorro, I was in government for a long time and actually building generative AI systems prior to generative AI being a thing that people talked about. So I don't know where we want to take the conversation.
I want to know. I want to have in my mind, here's the person that's solving this, or you're solving the problem for somebody who's trying to build a house and they need all these supplies, or they're trying to renovate a house and they need these supplies.
Yep.
But then in my mind, I'm generalizing that to the same tools to say, you need another hammer, you need another light switch, you need another toilet, you need an extra large toilet as opposed to a regular toilet. These preferences for buying and
Yep.
behaviors for buying, how does that generalize to picking a song or buying stuff at the store in person, or whatever? Like, what are the other cases where the same problem exists but for a different profile of a person or a user?
Yep.
And then I want to know, like, how does it all work? You know what I mean?
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah.
So maybe the next piece is then who's the go from renovating Terry's farmhouse to the next piece is, okay, who are in the circles right outside of MRO that are using the same kind of solutions? And then Terry's going to ask you 1,000 questions about how the solutions work.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you think about some of the solutions that we're building, whether that's search, recommendations, kind of these affinity related concepts of, hey, what do I like? How can I put that in front of customers? You see that in a lot of different domains. So obviously there's the e-commerce kind of problem, but we talked a little bit about the music concept of, I like these songs, or, hey, I like this shirt that I have here. And what you can actually get into is, hey, I like this article. I like this topic. I like this this kind of general style of writing. And you see these things manifesting in like how Facebook curates your feed, how Instagram curates your feed. And so the same concepts are actually pervading all of these different domains where you've got knowledge of the individual and observations about their behavior. And now you have to layer those two things together to say, given what I know about this person, given what I know about their previous behaviors and their interactions, where can I take them next? And when we think about some of these concepts or questions, often we're looking at, how do we prevent dead ends? How do we prevent you from getting stuck and not knowing where to go next? And so what we want to do is make sure that you have paths to get to the next kind of thing. And it's the same thing with with the social media platforms, right? They want to make sure that you have a next action, a next click, a next place to go that keeps you in their ecosystem and engaged in the content that they have. So in the broad scheme, a lot of these concepts, a lot of the models that go behind it are actually doing the same things across a bunch of different domains.
Give me an example of a dead end.
So a dead end would be if you came in and said, I want to find a particular hammer. And we showed you a hammer that wasn't the right hammer. And we said, sorry, that's the only hammer we're going to show you today. Mm-hmm. So you'd get to that page and you say, that's not the one that I want. I'm going to go find it somewhere else. I'm going to leave this site and I'm going to go find it at a different site. So what we want to do instead is say, hey, if this is not the right hammer for you, here are some options that may be more in line with what you want. And we'll show you a recommendations carousel. And if you interact with that recommendations carousel, we take that as a signal that, hey, there might actually be something in the relationship between that first item that you saw that wasn't the right one for you and the next item that you clicked on. And over time, that's how we actually build the knowledge and understanding of the relationships between all of the products so that we can say, hey, if Terry comes in and he's looking for the same kind of hammer, how do I get him into the right place? Well, I use all the knowledge of what I've seen other people do as they've navigated through our site and our products to help you land in the right place as fast as possible.
Dan, how much of that is heuristics versus algorithmic?
It's largely algorithmic. So you can use heuristics in the sense of saying, hey, I have a general hypothesis that certain types of people might be interested in certain types of products. The way that we build out those capabilities really comes down to large data sets. So we take the entire history of all of the things people have done on our website, crunch that down into sets of relationships so that we can say, hey, if you've seen this sequence of products, maybe the next product that you'd want to see is this one. Or if you've navigated through different parts of our assortment this way, we've seen that kind of behavior before. Let's get you to the right place. Now, one of the interesting problems that we ran into in this context was most of the recommendations algorithms aren't set up to handle the data sparsity that we have. So I mentioned we have 12 million products. Very few of those are actually items that people buy regularly. A large portion of them have never sold or never will sell, right? Like they're very specialized items. And so you have this problem of, I may have zero observations about you interacting with this product or anybody buying this product. So how can I actually take matrix multiplication and make that work in a data sparse environment? And the answer is it's really hard. The techniques that are out there that are commonly implemented didn't work for us. We tried them, they didn't work. And so we had to go back and rewrite essentially from the ground up how we would think about doing this recommendations problem with such sparse matrices, and built something that can handle that and probably does it in a way that is pretty relevant and interesting for other kinds of businesses that have that same problem.
I think what you just said should be the banner slogan, call it what you will, of all applied data science. The answer is it's really hard. It's really hard. It's easy to write articles about the possibility of an algorithm. It's really hard to get outcomes with data science. Takes a lot of work. Correct. So in that sense, there's a VentureBeat article from a few years back that says 90%, this stat blew my mind. It doesn't blow my mind, but it does. 90% of data science projects don't make it into production. Do you think that's accurate, or do you think that's a little high?
My experience is that would be high for me and my teams. I think that's probably reasonable across industry. I think there's a lot of times when people want data science solutions, but don't quite know what the problem is that they're looking to solve. And in those cases, I think you can invest a lot of time building something or experimenting and never actually reach a production ready kind of model. My experience within Zorro and even prior to that was, probably 50 or more % of the models that we build, that we get all the way through the point of saying like, hey, this is something that we want to invest time and energy into, we'll make it to production. So we have several dozen production models in revenue critical processes. So I think it really depends on how much has your company or your organization invested in understanding which problems can be solved with data science and which ones maybe can't be solved that way.
Yeah. So let's go back in the journey. We understand the Zorro, sort of what you're doing today. Let's go back a little ways. How did you get into data science? I know you were a degreed engineer. I believe mechanical. Is that correct? And
Correct.
how did you? Which, by the way, to me, this is the paradigm for a data scientist. The paradigm. I don't want a computer scientist. I want someone who's been an engineer in some other specialty and knows how to write code and knows the fundamentals of data science. So with that as background on you, take us through how you made your way to data science.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a degreed mechanical engineer, and I came into my career thinking that I would go work in typical mechanical engineering spaces, automotive, aircraft, that kind of thing. Well, my first job out of college was with the government, and I was working at a three-letter intelligence agency out in DC. So got hooked up very early on with a domain that I was not all that familiar with, and once I was there, fell very quickly into the quantitative analysis side of things. So even though I had a mechanical engineering degree, I wasn't doing engineering. I was doing quantitative analysis, statistics, that kind of thing. I did that for a while. I tried my hand at the actual engineering work in the Navy submarine program for a while, and then came back and said, hey, where I really want to settle is in this data science space, in the mathematical areas, and came back into CIA, the government agency I was working for, helped to stand up a data science program for them as well before I jumped to Zorro. So it's really I fell into it because it was my first job had a bit of a statistical and quantitative component to it, and then I followed that path all the way through.
And so roughly what year are we talking?
So that was back in 2006. So this was before the term data science existed as a term that people would use. I think that came around in 2009. So at the time, people called it quantitative analysis or statistical methods or whatever.
Was 2006 pre or post big data being a thing?
Pre.
Yeah, I think that was maybe on the front end of kind of that whole concept.
This concludes my deep technical questions, Terry. Please bail me out here.
So we have a thing, Dan, and I like what you just said. We have a thing that we come back to repeatedly when we talk about whatever we talk about. And it's that we don't need to classify the thing as a thing. It's just do the thing to solve the thing. And so I like that you said it was quantitative analysis, and someone eventually said that is data science. So we have an appreciation for that. We talk about that a lot. So did you teach yourself Python? Did you go formally through some sort of certification process? How did you get the actual coding skills? And then how did you learn sort of the best practices of data science?
Yeah, that was self-taught, and I had a lot of really sharp people around me who helped to get me kind of through that very quickly. So I don't have a formal computer science background. I think I spent a lot of time trying to make things work and finding out that they didn't quite work the way that I thought they did, and that's pretty good learning. That's how people have asked me in the past, like, hey, how can I get better at writing Python code? And I'll say, write it and figure out why it doesn't work, right? Like it's you can't sit down and read it in a book and come out and be good at it. You have to actually sit and do it. So that was how I learned. And then obviously being in an environment where there was a lot of resources, a lot of emphasis on understanding what we have in our data collections. The intelligence agencies have a lot of data, right? Think about all the things that CIA and NSA and all these different places can collect. There's a lot of information. And so how do you parse through that? How do you make sense of it? So it was a ripe ground for me to actually learn all the skills that I needed there.
So I'm gonna ask a few questions around that job, and I trust that you will say I can't talk about things that you can't talk about. Application wise, you mentioned, I would assume, and you mentioned that those and that that your employer specifically and other agencies like them have really rich and robust data sets. What was the infrastructure like early on? You know, we think a lot about latencies and things to how the infrastructure is built, the pipelines are built to solve problems with data science today. We talk about that a lot, like lead guitarists talk about their gear. Uh, how was it back then? Is it just we've got everything stored in a SQL warehouse somewhere, or was there emphasis placed on the infrastructure for the data, the pipelines that you worked with?
Yeah, there's a lot of emphasis on infrastructure. So within CIA, we had, for example, supercomputing capabilities. So you had in-house opportunities to build on top of that if you needed it. We were actually early adopters of uh, the what's now known as the government cloud, right? So we had essentially an Amazon Web Services equivalent that stood up and actually served as the infrastructure that we built everything on top of. So I think CIA was actually one of the places that understood very early on how to take advantage of infrastructure and how to put that in the hands of the people who needed that capability to process and make sense of the data.
So was there a push or a pull for that sort of leading edge knowledge of infrastructure and quantitative analysis? Did someone from up top request that, or were there a bunch of young, ambitious Dans working for the CIA that drove that upward?
It was a combination of both. So I think at the high levels, we had the executive buy-in to say, yes, this is something that we need to do, which is critical if you want to have an effective data science program. You have to have a leadership that's willing to invest and not just financially invest, but like invest in the potential risk of these things, you know, working out or not working out. So we had supportive senior level leadership. We had resourcing that went behind that. But I think in terms of identifying where there were opportunities, how do we actually stand up something that can be effective? What are the best practices? What kind of skills do you even need to have an effective data science program? A lot of that came from the grassroots level.
So I think, well, before I get to that question, can you talk about a fun application or two? Anything can you get us in trouble with the CIA today?
I certainly don't want to do that. I don't want to be in trouble with them either. Let me think of a good example that I can give you that had some of these applications involved. So one of the projects that I found pretty interesting was, you know, hey, we've got a lot of information about kind of how different organizations, militaries maybe think about the capabilities that they have. What do their actions tell us about what they actually can and cannot do? And so one of the tasks that I had was taking a bunch of historical observations about how do countries respond to different kinds of events around the world and using that to draw inferences and conclusions about how would they respond to certain kinds of behaviors. So if, for example, there's a provocative action where, you know, somebody sends a warship into the Persian Gulf. What is that actually going to do? And so we could model out all these different countries' reactions to things like that because we had lots and lots of observations about how they tend to respond, and also lots and lots of information about what their doctrine was that went behind those decisions. So that was a pretty interesting project. I probably can't talk too much more deeply about, you know, what specifically we were trying to model there, but like I think that's a good example of combining some qualitative and quantitative pieces to actually draw kind of broader.
I have a capability question.
Yeah.
So, in that example, you're talking about, you know, military capabilities of an adversary or industrial capability or whatever, the things that a country can do. In a shop environment, you might have a factory, and you have, you know, factory X and factory Y, and each of those factories has a capability to, I don't know, make widgets or gadgets, right? And if the widget factory is over capacity, you need to get more widget capacity at the gadget factory, and vice versa, right? So the question is, what do you see as state of the art and most promising about being able to sort of model and express capability for a factory or an adversary or a person or a website or anything. Like, tell me about where modeling, measuring, and expressing, and then using capabilities stands in this space.
Yeah. So there are a couple of techniques that I think are pretty interesting when you think about how to model a capability like that, or how to model the behavior of an entity. So um, there's a whole domain known as agent-based modeling, which essentially takes this concept of, hey, I've got a bunch of independent actors who all have their own motivations. How can I put them into a system and then understand how they respond in the context of all of the other actors and activities that are happening there? So, in the case of uh, website behavior, because we do a lot of that in my current job, what you want to try to understand is how similar are these people to other people? Like who tends to behave in the similar ways? And from that, can I actually start to think about what those people might do if I put them in different situations, if I gave them different experiences? And then we can go and test that. You can actually put people into different experiences, different situations, and say, how close were my predictions to what I thought would happen? And from that, you can either learn, like, my models are not very good, therefore I need to go back and change the way that I think about the modeling, or you can learn that, hey, the way that people behave sometimes fits the model, but sometimes deviates pretty far from it. And that actually helps you understand where you might need to invest more time and energy to build those kinds of things that will actually support those unexpected behaviors.
So one more question. I mean, we could probably do a whole episode on just the agency as far as you could talk about it. But I think from my seat, from Russ's seat, from everybody else who hasn't worked in said 3-letter agency seat, there's the perception of the place as this creepy back alley, clandestine. Obviously, that's the title. But from a cultural standpoint, as a person who went to work every day in that facility, did it feel that way? Did it feel like you were just going to Zorro, or to your basement desk? I'm assuming for Zorro. What did it feel like culturally? Did you have the vibe of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington? Like it's a culturally, did the work just feel like any other office, or did you're aware of where you are?
You're certainly aware of where you are. I think there's work that feels like the other work. Anywhere you go that has expense reports and all that stuff, like, you're going to have to do that, and CIA certainly has that. But I think that the difference for me is, when I was at CIA, there were very clearly capabilities that we had that nobody else had, which is super interesting. There's a very well-established sense of purpose and mission. So everybody in the organization knows what you're trying to accomplish. They know how you want to go about doing that. And when you take a second and you really think about the work that you're doing, you realize it's very much very impactful in the grand scheme of how you think about, a job. So for me, it wasn't just a job. There some of my favorite memories of working there. I had opportunities to, for example, go down to the White House and sit and brief senior executives in the government about things that were happening in the world and how they should think about AI. Right? What's the framework that you use to think about artificial intelligence and the national security risks of that? And can you regulate it at all? Like, all of that stuff all those questions were questions that I was able to grapple with and actually work through with the highest levels of government.
So were there breathing exercises before the meeting with senior executives at the White House? Like, is that something that Dan Buttera would be nervous about, or that's just part of the job?
It's part of the job. I mean, you certainly get, depending on who's going to be in that meeting, you can feel a little bit nervous going into it. I think that's normal for everybody, but I actually had the opportunity to go and talk in the White House Situation Room. If you've ever seen the picture of the Osama bin Laden raid, right? There's a bunch of people sitting around in that little conference room. So I'm in that conference room talking to people about AI, foreign military capabilities. Like, those are the things that you realize, hey, this is more than just a job. This is something that really has pretty big impact on how decisions get made, how people think about different pieces of the how you govern a country, right? And, like, I was at the core of that.
Terry, DC is funny. It's like the duality is you have to fill out an expense report. And I used to fall asleep on a bus and miss my stop. And then it turned around at the CIA headquarters. And that was just like, that's just part of my commute. So it goes back in the woods and it's, in this secret thing, gated, whatever. Everybody has to get out and go through security, external security before they go through internal security. But I'm just on the bus trying to get to work and I accidentally fell asleep. And that world, that just day-to-day real life, filling out expense reports, commuting on the bus world is immediately adjacent to I'm in the situation room briefing world leaders, and the two are continuously living right next to each other. Dan, I don't know if that matches your DC experience as well.
It does. Yeah. No, it's interesting to sit and think about like how much activity is going on in DC around you that has really big world-changing impact, and you just kind of may never. I think you become acutely aware of it the longer you're there, but it was still impressive to me to walk into the State Department and be able to sit down and talk to people, because like you get the sense that, hey, there's actual big things that are being talked about and happening and decisions being made, but it can feel a little mundane when you're sitting in traffic on the Beltway.
So my last question, Your Honor, um, from a data, you're now in leadership in data science, and it's not just it's still problem solving. I can relate to that, but you're also building teams and keeping lights on, keeping the train moving, that sort of thing. What aspects of data science leadership sour you on the job? Because I think those of us who like to solve problems with data, that's one thing. But then there's this piece, and it's not just the team building piece, but it's the liaison piece between the technical work that you're supposed to do and these people who couldn't spell AI, that are betting their, they're playing those games. And so what that the leadership piece of data science for you, 1 to 10, 1 is bamboo shoots under the fingernails, 10 is frolicking through the meadow with my family and ice cream cones. Where does the leadership part of that come in for you?
So I would say I'll give it like a 7.5. There are certainly things that you find as a leader in the data science space that are challenges, right? Like if you're a person who likes to solve problems, I spend much less of my day solving hard technical problems than I do spend solving organizational problems or communication problems. And so the thing that I find a lot of joy in, though, is I have some really great people on my team, super sharp people. And when I can help them when I can enable them to find the solutions to problems that are really hard technical problems, like that's gratifying in its own right. So I I don't I'm not doing a lot of hands-on coding today. I do a lot of understanding the needs, communicating, um, but I still get to stay close to the technical problems because I've got such a sharp team that is solving really hard things. I think if I was working with a group that was building maybe less capable applications, like that may not be as enjoyable. But I think leading a really capable data science team, I enjoy that nearly as much as sitting down and doing the work itself.
What are you running away from most, or what do you consider the biggest threat, challenge, competitor, something like that? And you can answer this in terms of Zorro, or you could answer it in terms of general data science problem solving.
Biggest competitor in the sense of, so I think for Zorro, like there's a lot of places that you can get the kinds of things that we sell, right? So hey, how do we make sure that we're relevant? How do we make sure that we are helping those customers who come to us actually get the things that they want? That's a perpetual challenge. I'd say that's kind of a core part of our business, and we have to keep working on that every day to get better at it. For data science problem solving in general, I think one of the biggest challenges that I see is expectations. People come in and they assume that, hey, there's this really deep, meaningful answer that we should just be able to get to. And sometimes there isn't. Sometimes there's something that takes weeks or months, or you spend months and you find nothing at the end of it. Like, it's not every project that you take on doesn't result in a reward. And I think that can be hard for people to understand that, hey, there's risk. We have to be okay with taking risk, and we have to understand that not everything will pan out. That's probably the biggest problem solving challenge I have.
So when you're describing not everything's going to pan out, you got to communicate with the whole team and stakeholders up the chain and side to side. That made me think of another question. Do you consider what you're doing day to day to be a lot of R&D, a little bit of R&D, not really R&D at all?
I think there's a balance. So I would say we do a fair bit of R&D. We're not out doing scientific research, but I think we're doing a lot of things where it requires a deep understanding of the space to be able to say, hey, does this concept make sense in the context of my problem? Like, am I actually going to be able to solve that recommendations problem with something that exists? Or do I have to go back to foundations and start building from scratch? And so in a lot of cases, I think the things that I look for when I hire data scientists, for example, are how deeply do you understand the concepts behind the things that you're doing? Because anybody can go and say, I can write some Python code and I can interface with this machine learning library. That's not hard to do. But do you really understand what that algorithm is doing behind the scenes? Do you know how to know whether that's good? Can you tune it? Can you improve upon it? And so those kind of pieces are R&D in the sense that, like, we might actually be blazing new ground, but there's still a lot of things that a business needs that are not going to require deep research and development investment.
All right, this is my last one, and then we'll wrap up. Go back in time, Terry, please.
I'll have one more after your last one.
No, you go ahead. I want to hear yours.
I think Dan will be finished after I ask this question.
Okay. Well, why don't we skip mine? I want to hear what you have here.
Okay. So Dan, we do a segment called 10 random questions, and it basically should be 10 absurd questions. So I'm going to hit you with one of the questions from 10 random questions, and feel free to use your search engine of choice or your AI engine of choice. Or if you have it off the top of your head, then you're better than us. So Bob Barker, did he get his name? Is that a stage name drawn from the Carnival Barker?
God, geez, I've watched a lot of The Price is Right, but I've never thought about this question itself. So
Terry never stops thinking about Bob Barker. Actually,
I don't.
That's funny. I want to say real name.
Russ,
I've disappointed Terry.
Almost half credit. Isn't his name Robert Barker? Yeah.
Yes, but real name is the question. The essence of the question is stage name from Carnival Barker or real name.
I'm sorry, I was half paying attention because I was thinking about how often you were thinking about Bob Barker, and that distracted me from knowing how to answer the question correctly.
So Dan, your Price is Right. Your viewing of Price is Right, was it for Bob Barker, or did you enjoy the games? Like what brought you to Price is Right?
Yeah, for me, it was more the games, I would say. I like the strategy behind the games, of, hey, I'm going to bid $1 because, like, that gives me the best chance of doing this, or, like, I'm going to intentionally truncate the other person's, like, range of opportunity by bidding $1 above what they did. So, like, those kinds of things where you go, there's actual strategy behind this. Like, that was pretty interesting to me.
So how many 50, 60%, how many prices of showcases did you get? Like, you would have taken home the car?
Oh, I don't think I was very good at it. This was all back in the day where I don't think I had a great concept of how much should a car cost. It's like, I don't know, $12, and it's like, nope, cars are more than that.
Okay, one last game show question, and you guys are a little younger, so you might not have ever seen this. I think you did, though. Bozo the Clown. Did you think did you know for certainty every morning at 6:45 a.m. that you would be dropping the ball in each of those buckets?
Yeah, I mean, there's always the like, I could do that. Like that could be, that's not that hard.
Did you ever set up and practice? That's the real question.
I'm sure we did. Yeah, at home, you got the the lines and the buckets, and I never made it on the show. I was never like, I really want to get on the show and do it in real life. But yeah,
I'm
definitely
surprised
practice.
a Chicago area guy. I'm surprised that you weren't like at Bozo's. You weren't at the door like frequently. Let me in.
Knock down the door and go throw the
Yeah.
balls. Yeah,
Yeah. I work for the CIA, Bozo. I get to throw these balls.
that's right.
I'm
Yeah.
not. I'm not sure that walking into places where there's clowns and insisting or declaring that you're from the CIA is good for your tenure at the CIA.
Probably not.
Probably not.
Terry, you got any closing words for us today?
Nah, other than thank you, Dan. We'd love to have you come do this again. It was I think there are spots, in a first conversation, I think we find spots where it would be neat to double click and go a little deeper, and then have you talk about things with us that are outside of data science. I'm sure you have interest outside of data science. So it was fun. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thanks a ton. Appreciate you being on.